Hello, bookish enthusiasts, and get ready to be transported to different worlds, one page at a time. Today, we unlock the doors to Fire Blood by George R.R. Martin. Liking my videos is like giving me a virtual high five, and following my channel is like becoming part of an awesome community. So, if you're enjoying what you see, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment to join the conversation. Aegon's Conquest. The book begins with a title page in which the history is said to be constructed by Archmaester Gyldayn of the Citadel of Oldtown, here transcribed by George A.R. Martin. 1. Gyldayn opens by telling us that history in Westeros is determined by Aegon's conquest, with time moving forward after the conquest and time moving backwards before the conquest. The Targaryens were one of about 40 different Dragonlord families who struggled for power in Valyria, a city in the east that fell in an event called the Doom of Valyria. Aegon Targaryen moved his whole family to a faraway island, Dragonstone, 12 years before the Doom, when his daughter Daenerys, the Dreamer, foresaw the destruction of Valyria, the furthest Valyrian outpost to the west. The Targaryens spent 100 years on the island before Aegon the Conqueror, born 27 BC, set sail for the west. Weed to both his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys. The three siblings each rode their own dragons to conquer Westeros, which was divided into 7 kingdoms full of constantly warring families. After attempting to make a peaceful arrangement with Argilac, the arrogant of the Durrandon, Aegon and his sisters let forth a burst of ravens that traveled to all 7 kingdoms in Westeros, proclaiming there was now only one king, Aegon the Conqueror, and the old kings could either bend the knee or be destroyed. He had himself coronated at the mouth of the Blackwater River. With only a few hundred men, Aegon and his sisters stormed Westeros with their dragons. The small folk cheered Aegon on, but the kings and their bannermen opposed him. The Westerosi armies were larger, but they were no match for the 3 dragons. Harren the Black, the king of the Riverlands, refused to bend the knee to Aegon, thinking that the impenetrable castle he had spent his reign building would shield him from dragons. King Argilac, the Aratan, heard what happened and decided he would not die the same way. He met the Targaryen army in battle during the last storm. They nearly had the advantage until Rhaenys appeared with her dragon. Orys Baratheon, Aegon's first hand of the king and probable bastard brother, met Argilac in battle and killed him. Argilac's daughter, Argella, barricaded herself in their castle and said she and her men would die before surrendering, but her men opened the gates in the middle of the night and delivered their lady naked and chained to Orys, who dressed her and told her of her father's death, then took his sigil as his own and asked Argella to marry him. The 2 western kings, Lannister and Gardner, assembled the largest ever army and marched north. They outnumbered the Targaryens 5-1, but the dragons conquered them without much struggle. Aegon installed the living members of the royal families as his wardens rather than killing them, and selected loyal men in the cases where the entire family had been destroyed in battle. The Stark army marched south, but when they approached the Targaryen forces, King Tyrion bent the knee in order to protect his men from burning. Visenya rode her dragon into the Vale and convinced the Arryns to yield without a fight, but Rhaenys could not convince the Dornish queen to do the same. Aegon took his forces to Oldtown, the biggest city in Westeros and the center of the faith. The High Septon had fasted and prayed for 7 days before telling Manfred Hightower, Lord of Oldtown, to surrender or the city would burn. Aegon walked into the city, and 3 days later, the High Septon anointed him King of the Seven Kingdoms, though Dorne had still not been conquered in the Starry Sept. This coronation was witnessed by many more people, and so marks the fixed start of Aegon's rule, although he had been calling himself a king for 2 years. He declared that he would build himself a city on the 3 hills where he and his sisters first set foot on Westeros, King's Landing. Reign of the Dragon. The Wars of King Aegon I. The first 13 years of Aegon the Conqueror's rule was marked with war and strife throughout Westeros. In the Bight, the Sutherlands declared their lady a queen until Visenya arrived on her dragon. On the Iron Islands, several contenders vied to be their own king, including Lodos, who said he was son of the Drowned God. When Aegon arrived on his dragon and conquered the islands, Lodos prayed for the Krakens to rise up and kill the dragon. When they did not, he walked into the sea with rocks in his pockets, and thousands of his followers came with him. Aegon allowed the Ironborn to choose their own warden, and they selected Vicon Greyjoy, who swore fealty to Aegon. Dorne was the only kingdom in the south that had not submitted to Aegon, so he and his sisters attacked the kingdom. Rhaenys burned Planky Town, but the town was on a river and almost everyone hid from the fire in the water. Lord Tyrell took a group of men to meet the Dornish in battle, but the Dornish refused to meet in battle. Instead, they retreated and led the would-be conquerors on a wild goose chase through the desert, poisoning the wells and crops along their way. Orys Baratheon and his men were trapped in between rock slides, and everyone except Orys and a few others, who were kept for ransom by the widow lover of Weil, were killed. Aegon conquered a few empty castles full of women and children, and then met Rhaenys at Sunspar, which she had. Since no one was there to fight, including the princess of Dorne Maria Martell or the Yellow Toad, Aegon announced victory and installed his own men. As soon as he was back in King's Landing, the Dornish men came out of hiding and overthrew all the Castellians, killing and torturing them. The war continued for years without much progress. In 7 Act, the widow lover ransomed Orys back to King's Landing. When Aegon realized that he had cut off Arrys's sword hand, he burnt Wiles, but the widow, Lover hid in caves and tunnels beneath the mountains. In 10 Act, Rhaenys was leading an attack on Hellhole when a defender launched a scorpion that his her dragon, Meraxes, in the right eye. Meraxes crushed the tower and died. No one knew whether Rhaenys died in the fall or beneath her dragon or in prison years later. Aegon and Visenya spent the next 2 years scorching all of Dorne, paying ransoms to anyone who would kill a Dornish lord, and escaping from several assassination attempts themselves. In 13 Act, Maria Martell died in her sleep. She was succeeded by her son Nemor, who sent his own daughter, Daria, to King's Landing to broker peace. Aegon was about to refuse, but then Daria gave him a personal letter that changed his mind. He flew to Dorne and agreed to peace without surrender, and so the Dornish were the first and last to conquer Aegon, who ruled Westeros for 24 years without another war. 3 heads had the dragon. Governance under King Aegon I. After the fighting was over, Aegon turned his attention to solidifying the 7 kingdoms as a single realm. He and his sisters brokered marriages between houses all over the realm, fostered children at court, and spent half his year traveling to other castles in order to mingle with his lords and ladies. But he also set up court wherever he went, so he could hear the small folk. He traveled with 6 mesters to educate him on the customs and histories of the lands, and in order to make note of his decrees, mostly, he allowed the kingdoms to run as they had before because he wanted to create peace. Before he conquered Westeros, hardly a few months went by without fighting breaking out in the realm. Under his rule, he expected small folk to take issues to their lords, and lords to take issues to him. He allowed the faith and the High Septon to retain power, although he was not a religious man. King's Landing grew out of the small base it had been during his arrival in Westeros to the third largest city in the realm. While ruling, Aegon implemented the position of Archmaester for the monarchy and developed the initial idea for the small council. Rhaenys created a system of patronage for musicians that benefited art and the Targaryen legacy, and ruled that women could only be struck 6 times if they were unfaithful. Visenya insisted that Aegon needed a group of 7 warriors protecting him at all times, and so the King's Guard was established. The Sons of the Dragon. In 7 Act, Rhaenys gave birth to Aenys Targaryen. He was small and sickly, and some said that he might be the base-born son of one of Rhaenys' favorite singers or mummers. When she died, the boy and Aegon were distraught. In 12 Act, Visenya gave birth to Maegor, who was strong and healthy. In Valyria, incest and plural marriages were the norm, but in Westeros, both were forbidden by the faith. Aegon had no daughters, so his sons married outside their bloodline, Aenys to his cousin Alyssa Velaryon, the daughter of Aegon's master of ships, in 22 HU. When they gave birth to Rhaena, Queen Visenya suggested the infant be betrothed to Maegor, but the parents and the High Septon objected, so Maegor married Cerys Hightower in 25 Ace Sheptower in 25 Ace at the suggestion of the High Septon. Over the next few years, Aenys and Alyssa had 4 more children, 3 boys and a girl, but Maegor and Cerys did not have any despite their efforts. In 37 Act, Aegon died of a stroke while with his grandchildren on Dragonstone. Aenys was crowned king, and when Maegor knelt to him, Aenys pulled him up and said they would rule together. But Visenya and others at court said Aenys was too weak to be king and only Maegor should rule. Amidst the change, several rebellions roared up in the Vale, the Iron Islands, and Dorne. Aenys did not react strongly, but Maegor took his father's dragon and squashed the rebellion in the Vale, hanging all the traitors, even the lords. Orys Baratheon led an army to Dorne and conquered half their army, taking captive the son of the widow lover, Lord Walter Weil, and cutting off his hands and feet. Orys died on the return from his injuries, but is said to have died happy. When the rebellions had all been stopped, Aenys hailed his brother a hero and named him Hand of the King. They ruled together for 2 years, but when Aenys had another daughter, Maegor announced Cerys was barren and took another wife, Alice Haraway, in an illegal ceremony performed on Dragonstone by Visenya without the consent of Aenys. All the lords of the realm and the High Septon condemned the marriage, and Aenys gave Maegor an ultimatum: end the second marriage or be exiled for 5 years. Maegor went into exile for 5 years. Maegor went into exile with his new wife. When the Red Keep, which his father had started building, was nearing completion, Aenys announced that his eldest 2 children, Rhaena and Aegon IE, would wed one another. The High Septon denounced this, and Visenya told Aenys that he needed to either call off the wedding or burn down the Starry Sept. Aenys did neither, and during the wedding, he announced that Aegon would be Prince of Dragonstone, which had been Maegor's official title, and this greatly upset Visenya. Aenys sent the newlyweds on a tour of the kingdom, but they were jeered by the faithful. The Septon who performed the marriage was killed in the streets by the poor fellows, and 2 of them snuck into the Red Keep and tried to kill Aenys, who was saved by his Kingsguard. Aenys moved to Dragonstone as a holy war broke out all through the realm. Rhaenys and Aegon III were trapped in a castle in Crakehall. The warrior sons, the Faith's militia, took over King's Landing. Aenys weakened and became ill, then died while under Visenya's care. Queen Alyssa and her children fled to her father's castle. Visenya flew east on her dragon and returned with Maegor, who named himself king and killed the Maester, who objected. Maegor flew to King's Landing and challenged the warrior sons to meet him, 7 against 7, in battle, so that the gods could decide who was just. Maegor won, but suffered injuries that left him unconscious for 27 days. His second wife, Alice, arrived from the east with a woman named Tiana of the Tower, a woman from Pentos who was rumored to be Maegor's concubine or Alice consort and to have supernatural powers. Visenya dismissed the Maesters and gave over care of Maega to Tiana, and the next morning the king awoke and flew to King's Landing, where he burnt 700 of the warrior sons at prayer in their sept. Then Maegor led a series of attacks on poor fellows, faithful extremists. Maegor won the battles on the back of his dragon, and then went back to King's Landing and married Tiana. Visenya convinced Alyssa to come back to King's Landing with her children. Rhaena and Aegon, Aya fled to Casterly Rock, and Rhaenys gave birth to twin girls that the High Septon called abominations. Rhaena begged her husband to take her and their children east, but he refused. Maegor demanded that all his enemies come to King's Landing to swear fealty and bring him a hostage, and that the High Septon himself needed to come and stand trial for treason. When they refused, Maegor and Visenya burnt down their castles, then turned to Oldtown to attack the High Septon. But before they arrived, he died. Accounts differ on the cause. But when Maegor arrived, the gates were open and the Targaryen banners were flying. 90-year-old Septon Pater was named High Septon, and he disbanded the poor fellows and the warrior sons. Maegor remained in Oldtown for 6 months, reconciling with his first wife and holding trials for the traitors, while Rhaena and Aegon II snuck back into King's Landings, stole their dragons, and returned to Pink Maiden Castle, where they assembled an army. During the first battle, Aegon II rode his dragon Quicksilver in battle against Maegor on Balerion, who descended on the smaller dragon and ripped his wing off, sending both falling to the ground. Maegor returned to the Red Keep and set about creating an heir, but none of his 3 wives got pregnant until Alice finally did. But Alice miscarried, and the child was deformed as a monster. Maegor executed all of the septas and the midwife, and then Tiana told him that Aelys had feared infertility, so her father, the Hand of the King, had sent over 20 men to her bedroom. Maegor tortured the men until they confessed, then killed Alice, her entire family, and all the men. When he returned from Harrenhal after killing off the last of her relatives, he found that his mother had died and Alyssa had fled with her 2 youngest children. Maegor had the 3rd, Viserys, tortured until he died. When the Red Keep was finally finished, Maegor killed all the workers so that its secrets would never escape. His first wife, Cirice, died suddenly, and Maegor decided to take 3 new wives, 2 widows, one whom he had widowed in order to wed, and his niece, Rhaena, whom he summoned back. He named her elder daughter his heir. Both widows got pregnant, but both delivered monstrous stillborns. Tiana admitted to poisoning the children, and he locked her in the dungeons, but the realm said Maegor was cursed. Alyssa returned with Alysanne and Jaehaerys, who proclaimed himself king. Lords flocked to him and abandoned Maegor, including Rhaena and her eldest daughter. Maegor met with his counselors in order to determine a plan. When he sent them away, He was alive, and his king's guard were at the door. When his wife Eleanor came into the throne room in the morning, she found his body impaled by the swords of the Iron Throne. Prince into king. The ascension of Jaehaerys. After Maegor's death, Jaehaerys, I rose to be king in 48-8 and rule for the next 55 years. He was only 14 when he was first coronated, so his mother Alyssa acted as queen regent, and she and his council ruled in his stead, but even at a young age he was invested in his realm and his rule. Their first order of business involved seeing to all of Maegor's supporters. They were imprisoned, and the council considered putting them all to death without trial, but Jaehaerys wanted the people to see he was not his uncle. He allowed all but the worst traitors who had tortured and killed Viserys at Maegor's order to go free so long as they swore fealty to him, sent a ward, and gave up certain lands and honors. Although the Holy Wars had officially ended, there was still discontent in the realm. A man who styled himself Septon Moon garnered a large following and called for the true Septon to denounce the Targaryens. He was assassinated by a woman who came to his tent under the ruse of seducing him. Once he was dead, his followers dispersed and Jaehaerys traveled to the Starry Sept in Old Town to be coronated. A week-long celebration ensued, and Sheer Joffrey Doggett, the Red Dog of the Hills and the leader of the outlawed warrior sons, attended and asked that the warrior sons and poor fellows be reinstated. Jaehaerys refused the request, but asked the Red Dog to join his king's guard, and he agreed. Jaehaerys and his party returned to King's Landing, but Rhaena took off on her dragon for Fair Isle. She left her twin daughters, Arya and Rhaella, behind. Arya and Livella behind. Arya was the heir and lived at court. She had always been quiet and shy, but her sister Rhaella, who was studying to be a septa at Old Town, was a loud and adventurous girl. After the coronation, their personalities seemed to switch, and many suspected their mother had swapped them. The year of the Three Brides, 49 Act, 49 Ache, is celebrated by historians as a peaceful and prosperous year, and is referred to as the Year of the Three Brides. Rhaena Targaryen married 17-year-old Andrew Farman, the second son of the Lord of Fair Isle, without asking permission. Her mother and Rhaegar Baratheon, the Hand of the King, were furious, but Jaehaerys and Alysanne were delighted. Soon after, Rhaegar Baratheon and the Queen Regent Alyssa announced that they were going to be married. Jaehaerys questioned Roger's motives, but did not want to speak against the marriage. The gold wedding was the largest the realm had ever seen, and lords from all over came to see the new king and his sister Alysanne, who impressed everyone when they flew in on their dragons. After the wedding, a week of festivities ensued in which a tournament was held to find knights to fill the remaining 5 spots of Jaehaerys' Kingsguard. After the wedding, Alyssa and the council began to search for a match for Jaehaerys in secret. They agreed only that he could not marry his sister Alysanne, so they decided to marry her to Roger's youngest brother. Somehow, Alysanne found out about the plans, and she told Jaehaerys, who took her to Dragonstone and married her in a ceremony with his Kingsguard standing witness, though the marriage was not consummated. When Roger and Alyssa arrived, Rhaegar ordered his men to separate the siblings, but the Kingsguard threatened to protect the king and queen with their lives. Alyssa ordered peace and silence from all, and returned with Rhaegar to King's Landing, while the newlyweds stayed in Dragonstone, a surfeit of rulers. After his secret marriage, Jaehaerys remained on Dragonstone, silently training and waiting to come of age with his queen. Alyssa and Roger both hoped to end the marriage before it was consummated and made public, so Alyssa devised to send Alysanne a group of servants, septas, and ladies who would hopefully teach her and Jaehaerys that incest was immoral. Roger installed a spy and seducer within the group, Corianne Wilda, a teenage girl who would later go on to write a book about her wild days before becoming a septa. In the book, Corianne says that a man, either Rhaegar or his brother, the texts differ, sent for her, inspected her body, and bid her to seduce the king and report back to him. Meanwhile, on Fair Isle, Rhaenyra had married Andro, who was 17 and feminine, but rumor had it that Rhaenyra was in love with his sister Alyssa Farman. When Andro's father died and his brother became lord, he kicked Rhaenyra out and tried to keep Alyssa from following her to Casterly Rock, but failed. Legend has it that Corianne might have slept with Jaehaerys, but whether she did or not, it did not affect his union with Alysanne. A series of lords and ladies visited the island to garner favor with the king, and rumor of his marriage with Alysanne began to spread. Roger suggested that Jaehaerys was too selfish to be king and said that they ought to send him away and install Aeria Targaryen in his place. Alyssa wept and then took away his title as Hand of the King and sent him home. Alyssa gave the post to her brother, and from then on, left ruling to him. Roger sent his brother to Old Town to fetch Rhaella Targaryen, but the septa on duty called the guards rather than the girl, and they locked him up and told the crown of the traitorous plot. A time of testing, the realm remade. Jaehaerys returned to King's Landing as a true king on his dragon. Straight away, he set to work with his council, allowing some of his mother's choices to remain in place, but getting rid of others. When he had thoroughly cleaned out the castle, emptying the cells of prisoners his uncle had wrongly imprisoned, he called Rhaegar Baratheon to him. Roger assumed he would be sent to the wall at best and executed at worst. But Jaehaerys pardoned his treasons and asked him to return to his service under the condition that he act chivalrously toward Alyssa and Alysanne. With tears in his eyes, Rhaegar agreed. The king then went on to install Rhaegodraz, a foreigner from Pentos who had become one of the richest men in the world on his own. The kingdom was in debt, so Draz took out 3 loans from the Iron Bank of Bravos and its rivals in Myre and Tyrosh, Then Jaehaerys did away with all previous taxes and placed them on luxury items and crenellations. Next, the king sent for his queen, and they had a proper wedding complete with an official bedding and consummation. In hopes of making their marriage more palatable for the realm, Jaehaerys sent forth 7 preachers to tell the realm of Alysanne's goodness and love for the king and the realm. The endeavor worked, and the holy did not rise up against the king. Rhaenyra came to court and told Jaehaerys she wanted Dragonstone as her own. He said she could use it as a gift, but it would be his in name still. She asked for her daughter Aeria as well, and he agreed. Birth, death, and betrayal under King Jaehaerys. Jaehaerys spent more of his reign on the road than at home, almost always traveling with his queen and their 2 dragons. He traveled with a smaller retinue than Aegon had, and spent less time at each castle, so he could see more of his people and be less of a burden on them. During his first journey, he brought Alysanne with him, and she was attacked by a group of religious septas in Maidenpool while bathing in a spring where only women were allowed. Her ladies protected her, and she and her unborn child escaped unharmed. Afterwards, Jaehaerys asked Jonquil Dark, a female warrior, to be the queen's sworn shield. Alysanne's child was born early and died, but Alyssa and Roger gave birth to a healthy son, Boromund. On Dragonstone, Aeria and her mother Rhaenyra were unhappy with their lot, especially when Alysanne gave birth to a healthy girl, Daenerys, and pushed Aeria down the line of succession. The year 54 HE went down in history as the year of the stranger because of all the troubles, starting with the death of the court's beloved Septon. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra's lover Alyssa missed home. And wanted ships to sail east, but Rhaenyra said she would prefer her to stay. Alyssa left, stealing 3 dragon eggs to sell for ships. In Old Town, the High Septon died and the most devout me to select a new one. Jaehaerys and Alysanne traveled to Old Town to arrange for a Septon who would uphold the doctrine of exceptionalism, which legitimized sibling marriages between Targaryens. On their way home, word arrived that Alyssa was dying in childbirth. When they arrived, Roger ordered the Septas to save the child. Rhaenyra arrived too late to make amends with her mother and threatened Roger with dragonfire if he should ever wed again. When Rhaenyra went back to Dragonstone, a sickness broke out, killing the Maester and all off the young women on the island. Rhaego Draz told Jaehaerys it was not a sickness, but the tears of lies, a poison from the east. Rhaenyra realized her disgruntled husband had done it in retaliation for her neglect of him. But before she could arrest him, he jumped from a tower, killing himself. While Jaehaerys went about looking for a new hand of the king to replace Daemon Velaryon, Alysanne went to Dragonstone to comfort Rhaenyra. Arya begged to return to King's Landing, but Rhaenyra forbid it. After Alysanne returned home, Rhaenyra appeared on her dragon to tell them that Arya had stolen Balerion and flown away. Jaehaerys and Alysanne, their triumphs and tragedy. With no new news of Arya, Rhaenyra, or the dragon eggs, Jaehaerys dedicated himself to organizing and reforming all of the realm's laws. He set off on another journey across the realm while Alysanne went to Dragonstone and gave birth to a boy, Aemon. In King's Landing, construction on the gigantic dragon pit finally finished, and the monarchy held a great tournament there. Alyssa Farman changed her name to Alice Westhill and took her boat around Westeros to Old Town to find a crew to take her where only few had gone before, into the mythical sunset land she had dreamt of sailing since a girl. The Targaryens harred about her intent, but by the time they arrived to capture her, she had sailed away, and they could not find her. In 56 Ac, Arya appeared on Balerion in the middle of King's Landing, ragged and ill. She died days later under the care of Septon Benifer and Septon Barth, who said publicly that she died of a fever. But Barth's written account differs. In it, he writes that he suspected Balerion, born on Valyria, took Arya back to the doomed city as inside the girl were writhing monstrous worms, type creatures that burnt her from the inside out and died when put on ice. Jaehaerys banned travel to Valyria under penalty of death later that year. Rhaenyra, devastated, moved to Harrenhal where she remained alone until her death. Alysanne gave birth to another son, Balon, and he and Aemon became close as siblings can be. Septon Barth was made the new hand of the king, and he traveled to Braavos to talk to the Sea Lord of Braavos, who they suspected had bought the eggs from Alyssa. The Sea Lord arranged for all the debt of Westeros to be forgiven by the Iron Bank so long as he got to keep the eggs, which had hardened into rocks. Jaehaerys used the money to improve the city of King's Landing. Alysanne traveled to the north and won the hearts of the Starks at Winterfell and the men of the Night's Watch while waiting for Jaehaerys, who was attempting to negotiate a peace between Pentos and Tyrosh. But the aftermath proved unsuccessful. While at the Wall, Alysanne went to Molestown and held her women's court with the Horus and wenches who lived there. She heard tales of horror about the tradition of the first night in which lords were able to take the maidenhead of the bride and argued that the practice be abolished. Septon Barth agreed with her, and Jaehaerys assented. The long reign, Jaehaerys and Alysanne, policy, progeny, and pain. In 59 Ac, one of the ships traveling west with Alyssa Farman returned and said they had parted ways with her a year ago. She was never heard from again, but years later, Corlys Velaryon swore he spotted her ship at a port in Ashay. Winter arrived and a deadly plague from somewhere overseas called the Shivers broke out, killing thousands of highborn and lowborn people in Westeros. Chaos broke out in King's Landing as all the guards were sick, and Rhaego Drays was beaten to death in the streets for being a Pentashe. Jaehaerys rode into town himself and found the men responsible, then hung and disemboweled them. Daenerys Targaryen and many others died before the plague ran its course. Jaehaerys installed new members of his council and staff. Alysanne gave birth to Alyssa less than a year later, and a few years later, Maegor joined the family. Then Vaesa joined the family. Then Vaesergon, Daela, Saera, and Viserys. With Daenerys dead, the Targaryens named Aemon heir and weed him to Jocelyn Baratheon. After sending Miguel to take vows as a septa, Alysanne gave birth to Gaemon, her 11th, who died a few days later, as did Rhaena Targaryen, alone in Harrenhal. Seer Lucamore Strong of the Kingsguard was found to have taken 3 wives and sent to the Night's Watch. Aemon and Jocelyn gave birth to Rhaenys, and soon after Ballion married his sister Alyssa, and they birthed Viserys. Vaegon was sent to the Citadel to study. Alysanne gave birth to another child that died, but in Adiac she birthed Gale, who survived. Alysanne loved arranging marriages for lords and ladies, but was baffled when it came to her own children. Daela was anxious and frightened of everything and everyone, and rejected all suitors. Jaehaerys said that she had to pick someone by the end of the year, and so she wed Rodrik Arryn, a friend of the family. She died in childbirth, and Alysanne blamed Jaehaerys. A few years later, Alyssa and Ballion had their 3rd child. She and the child died. Alysanne and Jaehaerys got into another disagreement when their daughter Saera came of age. A wild and disobedient child, she grew into a rebellious teenager. She and her 2 ladies were discovered to have slept with 3 of her suitors. She was unrepentant and tried to steal a dragon, so her father sent her to join the Silent Sisters. She escaped and ran away to a whorehouse in Lys. Next, Alysanne matched Visera with Lord Theomore Manderly, a stout middle-aged man who was kind and would build a greater alliance between the Targaryens and the North. Visera tried to argue her way out of the marriage and seduce her widowed brother Balon, but to no avail. The night before she was to be shipped off, she switched clothes with her maid and went out on the town with friends, only to get in an accident that broke her neck. Distraught, Alysanne asked Jaehaerys to leave to retrieve Saera from Lys, but he refused her, and she began to resent him, sending him on a tour of the kingdom by himself. Rhaenys married Corlys Velaryon and got pregnant. Her father, Aemon, went to Tarth to deal with a Myrish conflict that had moved overseas and was killed with a poison arrow shot by an assassin at Lord Cameron. Princess Gao ran away with a singer. When she gave birth to a stillborn child, she killed herself in the sea. Alysanne, grief-stricken, died on Dragonstone in 100 Akenstone, in 100 Ak. Heirs of the Dragon. A question of succession. After Aemon died in battle, Jaehaerys named his brother Balon's successor rather than his daughter, Rhaenys, by Jocelyn. But in 101 Ak, Balon's stomach burst open during a hunting trip. In order to determine the line of succession, Jaehaerys determined to hold a great council at Harrenhal in order to decide on the next ruler. The council discarded bastards and females and came down to Viserys, son of Balon, and Laenor, son of Rhaenys, and Corlys Velaryon. The council decided on Viserys in a landslide that seemed to suggest succession would never pass through a female. In 103 Act, Jaehaerys died, and Viserys ascended to the Iron Throne. Viserys was 26 and had married Aemma, who he shared a daughter, Rhaenyra, he made his wild younger brother, Daemon, commander of the City Watch, though Daemon wanted to be heir to the throne. When Aemma died, giving birth to a boy who died, and Viserys discovered Daemon had been in a tavern making jokes about it, he officially named Rhaenyra his heir. Daemon left to Dragonstone with his whore, Mysaria, and got her pregnant, then gave her a dragon's egg. Viserys told Daemon to take the egg away and go home to the Val with his wife or be labeled a traitor, and Daemon agreed, sending Mysaria back to Lys. Mysaria died on the journey giving birth. Viserys remarried Alicent Hightower, and she produced several sons, but Viserys did not change his heir. Daemon went to sea with Corlys Velaryon, won victories against pirates, and styled himself King of the Narrow Sea. He appeared at court on his dragon and gave Viserys his crown. The brothers laughed, and Viserys remained at court the next 6 months. Rhaenyra was delighted to see her uncle, and the two spent much time together. Something transpired between the two that history does not know, but 6 months later, Viserys sent his brother away and started looking for a husband for Rhaenyra. Leonor Velaryon, who preferred men, was chosen against her wishes. A tension existed between Rhaenyra and Alicent. Rhaenyra's longtime companion and personal knight, Criston Cole, left her side and took a place beside Alicent. Rhaenyra replaced him with Sir Harwin Strong when her husband went off to his castle, Driftmark. Rhaenyra gave birth to Jacaerys, who looked like Harwin. At almost the same time, Alicent delivered Daeron. Daemon's wife died in an accident, and he married Lyanna Velaryon, daughter of Corlys Velaryon. Lyanna had twin girls and then a boy, who died along with her. Next, Rhaenys' husband Laenor was stabbed by his friend Ser Cor. At Laenor's funeral on Driftwood, the tension between Alicent's boys and Rhaenyra's boys came to a head when 3 of Rhaenyra's boys got into a fight with Alicent's Aemon when he called them bastards and they sliced his eye out. King Viserys ordered everyone to make up and threatened to pull the tongue out of anyone who called the heirs bastards again. He sent Rhaenyra back to Dragonstone and Harwin back to Dragonstone and Harwin back to Harrenhal, where he died in a fire. Rhaenyra married her uncle Daemon in a secret ceremony on Dragonstone and quickly had a child, Aegon, who looked like a true Targaryen. In 127 Act, after a near-death experience, the king held a feast in which all the children came and made peace with one another. But rumor has it that once the king went to sleep, the children fought. In 129 Act, King Viserys died in his sleep. The dying of the dragons, the blacks and the greens. The period between 129 and 131, in which the two rival branches of House Targaryen fought for power, is known as the Dance of the Dragons. The moment King Viserys died, Alicent met with the small council to determine how to proceed. The only person who disagreed with their plot to place her son Aegon, Aegon the Elder, the Master of Coin, was promptly killed. The conspirators keep the news secret for a week as they make preparations for the coming feud, and then Aegon was crowned in the Dragon Pit. When news reached Rhaenyra on Dragonstone, she went into labor and gave birth to a stillborn girl. Afterwards, she assembled her own council. She was woefully outdone in almost every category, but Alicent only had 4 fighting age dragons, and Rhaenyra had 12. One of her counselors suggested that she burn King's Landing, But she and her husband Daemon did not want to engage the dragons in battle. They decided to take Harrenhal first and send out the princes Jacaerys and Lucerys on dragons to rally allies to their cause. Rhaenyra held a coronation, and when King's Landing heard the news, Grand Maester Orwyle was sent to offer generous terms to Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra refused, and Aegon was furious. The dying of the dragons. A son for a son. Daemon went to Harrenhal on his dragon and captured the castle, along with a serving wench named Alice Rivers, who some said had magical powers. Jacaerys went to the Vale and convinced Lady Jean Arryn to join by promising her protection by dragon riders. Then he flew to White Harbor and convinced Desmond Manderly by offering his younger brother to wed Desmond's daughter. Then he flew to Winterfell and became friends with Cregan Stark. They betrothed their future children together and then signed a pact. Meanwhile, Lucerys rode to Storm's Inn to ask Boros Baratheon to join him, but Aemon Targaryen was there, promising to wed one of Boros' daughters. Boros denied Lucerys and Lucerys left. Aemond, who had lost his eye to Lucerys, followed him on his dragon, then killed Lucerys and his dragon. When Daemon found out, he hired a rat catcher and a guard from the city's watch to sneak in through the tunnels and kill Aegon's firstborn son, Jaehaerys. The dying of the dragons. The red dragon and the gold. Rhaenyra's supporters doubled as Aegon Ayat's supporters diminished. The king started drinking heavily and then named Sir Criston Cole Hand of the King. Two identical twin brothers had served visories on the King's Guard, but Sir Aeric remained loyal to Aegon, and Eric was loyal to Rhaenyra. Aegon sent Aeric to Dragonstone to impersonate his brother and kill the young princes in retaliation, but Eric spotted him and the brothers fought until their deaths. Criston Cole organized a series of attacks in the Riverlands. When Rhaenys, now 55, arrived on her dragon, Aegon and Aemon surprised her with their dragons. The three fought in the air, and only Aemon, Aegon, and his dragon survived. Though Aegon was so badly burnt, he remained in bed for the rest of the year, and his dragon could no longer fly. Aemon took over as protector of the realm. Aegon only had 2 dragons remaining, and so the Queen's Camp began looking for Targaryen bastards to ride the riderless dragons of Dragonstone so they could attack King's Landing. Before they got the chance, Aemon attacked by sea and captured the young Prince Viserys, who was being transported to Pentos for safekeeping. The Queen was despondent after losing her child, so she stayed at Dragonstone in mourning, where she had been for months, while Jacaerys sent 5 dragons to the fleet. Jacaerys and his dragon went down, enraging the Queen. Aemon concocted a plan to attack his uncle at Harrenhal, but Daemon learned of the attack from his spies weeks prior, and he and the Queen attacked King's Landing, which was protected by no dragons. With the help of Daemon's friends in the city, they conquered in just a day. Alicent bent the knee to Rhaenyra on the throne, but Aegon I had fled the castle. The dying of the dragons. Rhaenyra triumphant. Aemon took Harrenhal and felt victorious until he heard what happened in King's Landing. A series of battles took place in the Riverlands while Aemon remained in Harrenhal, and Sir Criston Cole set off to wage battle by land on his behalf. To refill the treasury, which had been emptied, Rhaenyra imposed a series of harsh taxes. She had her enemies killed, and people began to think of her as a female Maedon. Aegon's youngest son, Maelor, was discovered at an inn and killed along with his sworn knight. Aemon attacked the realm by dragon. Sir Criston met a host of Northmen in the battlefield and tried to surrender to them, but they refused and shot him with arrows. Aemon's younger brother Daeron had an army moving across the south. About 10,000 of Rhaenyra's bannermen were assembled at Tumbleton with 2 dragons flown by the seer Ulf White and Sir Hugh Hammer, bastards with Targaryen blood who had become dragon riders on Dragonstone. When the king's men approached, they switched allegiance and burnt the town. Daemon and a bastard girl named Nettles, who had become a dragon rider, hunted for Aemond and his dragon together to no avail. Rhaenyra began to suspect all the Targaryen bastard dragon riders of treachery and tried to have them all imprisoned. When she found out Daemon and Nettles were having an affair, she ordered the girl executed, but Daemon helped her escape, then went to Harrenhal to wait for Aemond. He arrived on Dragon, and they fought. Both dragons and Aemon's body were found dead, but Daemon's was not. The dying of the dragons. Rhaenyra overthrown. Rhaenyra's situation in King's Landing grew worse when Helena killed herself by jumping out of her tower. Rumor spread that Rhaenyra had killed her half-sister, and after the tales of the deaths of young Jaehaerys and Maelor, the city rioted. A religious prophet named the Shepherd, who had been preaching Targaryen doom for months, excited the masses, and lords and ladies and knights were butchered in the streets. 500 gold cloaks ran into a horde of 10,000, attempting to apprehend the shepherd, but were all slaughtered. The remaining gold cloaks restored a bit of order the next day, but the next night was worse. The mobs opened the gates of the city, and the shepherd instructed his followers to kill the Targaryen dragons in the dragon pipe. Prince Joffrey begged his mother to let him go to his dragon, but Rhaenyra refused. He stole her dragon, but it was resistant to the new rider, and Joffrey fell to his death before reaching the dragon pit. The mob killed all 3 dragons in the pit. Rhaenyra's dragon came back to the fight and died in battle, leaving King's Landing empty of dragons. Rhaenyra and her remaining son fled. For the next month, the prophet and 2 Targaryen bastards styled themselves kings, and chaos reigned. Back in Tumbleton, White and Hammer had both their dragons on hand, but would not go to King's Landing until they were promised Harrenhal and the crown, respectively. Prince Daeron and his men planned to kill Hammer, but then a bastard dragon rider, Adam Velaryon, came into the camp wishing to restore his name after Rhaenyra had called all bastards traitors. The 3 dragons all perished in the ensuing battle, as did Daeron, Hammer, and Adam. With 1 dragon left, White was the only rider left, and he wanted the crown, but was poisoned. Rhaenyra and her son went back to Dragonstone, which had been taken by the long-missing king Aegon I. His men had infiltrated the castle, but when they went to seize Baela Targaryen, Daemon's daughter, she escaped on her dragon, which just so happened to meet Aegon on his dragon. They fought, and Aegon's dragon, Aegon, and Baela all survived, though all were injured. Rhaenyra walked into the castle unaware that her brother was there. He took her son away and fed her to his dragon in 130 acts. The dying of the dragons. The short, sad reign of Aegon I remained on Dragonstone as he plotted how best to return to King's Landing. His dragon died, and he nearly had Baela killed, but decided he would use her to get the Velaryons, who had control of the sea, on his side. Meanwhile, Borros Baratheon heard of Rhaenyra's death and went to King's Landing and restored order with Alicent in the name of Aegon. Since Aegon could not get back without peace from the Velaryons, they conspired to agree to Corlys Velaryon's terms to get his help and then kill him later. Aegon returned to King's Landing, still unable to walk, and executed the 3 pretenders. Instead of forgiving his enemies, he executed them. At first, he refused to allow his daughter to marry Rhaenyra's son, Aegon, and named them his heirs, which would have united the two halves of the family. But when the master of whispers, Larry Strong the Clubfoot, urged him to agree to a betrothal now and call off the wedding late, he agreed. But the forces of the realm descended on his army 2 days outside the city and win in a landslide. Plotters inside the castle, led by Larry Strong himself, killed 20 of the most essential king's men. In 130, one act, Aegon was found poisoned. His daughter Jaehaira was wed to Rhaenyra and Daemon's son Aegon I. Aftermath. The Hour of the Wolf. At first, the realm seemed ready to accept peace under the new reign of 10-year-old Aegon I, and his bride Jaehaira. But then the Northmen, led by Cregan Stark, arrived. They said the war was not over yet, because not all the great lords had surrendered, and Casterly Rock and Old Town still held half the realm's gold, plus Storm's End still had Jaehaira and could easily crown her queen if they chose. The Northmen arrested Corlys Velaryon because they suspected him of poisoning the king, which they considered a heinous action. Casterly Rock and Old Town surrendered themselves and their gold, and Storm's End sent Jaehaira. The Northmen ran out of enemies. Corgan Stark was made Hand of the King, and he tasked himself with discovering who was responsible for the poisoning. He held a trial and found over 30 people complicit in the conspiracy. All of them chose to go to the wall rather than be beheaded. Aside from Larry Strong and Sir Giles Belgrave, a member of the Kingsguard who believed he should have protected his king better, and so deserved to be executed. Under the regents, the Hooded Hand, the Northerners left the capital and thousands flocked in to witness the royal wedding and coronation. Next, the king named his small council, installing both sides of the loyalists in equal numbers. A council of regency was then formed, featuring 7 lords and ladies from the realm in order to help run the kingdom. Sir Tywin Lannister, who had been horrifically tortured and had facial scars, was named Hand of the King. Queen Dowager Alicent refused to abide with the compromise and was confined to her rooms. Grand Maester Orwyle brimed his way out of being shipped to the wall and was found working in a brothel. Tywin, fond of the Maester, sentenced him to be held in a tower, where he was allowed to write his confessions. Baela and Rhaenyra, Daemon's daughters by Laena, were the presumed heirs to the king and his young queen, though the council was wary of attempting to name another woman an heir. Baela was wild and disobedient, so the council decided she should marry a man 40 years older than her. She refused and then ran away to marry her cousin Alan Velaryon in a secret ceremony. The council allowed Rhaenyra to help select her husband, and she married Corwyn Corbray. Despite all the marriages, the realm suffered from attacks from the Ironborn and plagues, and the winter in the north led to famine. Because so many men had been lost in the Dance of the Dragons, many widows were in power of great houses. Harrenhal had been abandoned to robbers and bandits, but when the king's men arrived to clear the castle, they found Aemon's mistress, Alice Rivers, and his bastard son, who she said was the true king. Maester Orwyle was released as the plague moved into King's Landing, killing Alicent and the Hand of the King, Tywin Lannister. Under the regents, war and peace and cattle shows. After Tywin Lannister's demise, the young king, at just 13, made a series of new appointments, but Unwin Peake, one of his 7 regents, undid his choices and instead selected his own men and appointed himself the king's hand and protector of the realm. Unwin was a cruel and harsh hand, treating the king and queen like hostages and executing many prisoners in spectacles. While the city was in his grasp, The rest of the realm was still being assaulted by famines and attacks from the Ironborn, and the sea was congested with a battle the free cities were waging against one another. Unwin sent Alan Velaryon, Baela husband, to sea, and he fought an entire fleet without permission and won the hearts of the small folk who saw him as a hero. In retaliation, Unwin asked Alan to defeat the Ironborn, a near impossible task. Rhaena had a miscarriage and Baela announced she was pregnant. Queen Jaehaera fell out of her window just as her mother had, either jumping or murdered by Unwin, whose bastard brother was the Kingsguard at her door during the time. A week later, Unwin announced that the king would marry his daughter, Miriel, but this enraged all the lords of Westeros. Unwin declared that a ball should be held instead, wherein the king could choose for himself. Unwin hoped to rig the ball in his favor by having his daughter seduce the king before the ball and eliminating her rivals, but Rhaena and Baela arrived with their ward, the orphaned niece of Alan Velaryon, and the king chose Dedanera. Under the regents, the voyage of Alan Oakenfist, Alan Velaryon started his voyage to conquer the roving bands of iron born from the Iron Islands who had been pillaging the western shores of Westeros from Fair Isle for years. He made peace with the flamboyant Tyroshi Rocalio Rindun, who was styling himself King of the Narrow Sea, and then made peace with the Dornish. By the time he arrived at Fair Isle, however, one of Dalton Greyjoy's wives, a low-born girl stolen from the shores of Westeros, had slit his throat in his sleep. The small folk had rebelled, and the Ironborn had returned home. Alan returned home, but while stopping in Dorne, a messenger told him that Prince Viserys Targaryen, who all had thought dead during the Dance of Dragons, was alive in Lys and married to his captive's daughter, Lara Rogare. Alan sailed to Lys and retrieved Viserys, paying a huge sum and promising to keep the marriage in place. Aegon, I was overjoyed to have his brother back, as was the court, save for Unwin, who resigned as Hand of the King, leaving all his men in place at court. The Lysene Spring and the end of Regency. The court celebrated the return of Viserys, but had no love for his wife and her foreign ways and gods, or her family, which they accused of being overly ambitious. Her father, a bank owner named Lysandro, became first magister for life in Lys, and her uncle Drazenki married the Dornish princess and became Lord of the Stepstones. Rhaena's small dragon Morning grew big enough to ride, and she flew it to Dragonstone where they stayed. Viserys and Lara welcomed their first child, Aegon IV. Baela and Alan welcomed their daughter, Laena. They placed an egg in his cradle, but the dragon hatched malformed and bit the girl. Aegon, its only friend, cupbearer, and food taster, died of a poison assassination, leaving Aegon bereft. Lysandro and Drazenki both died on the same day under suspicious circumstances that suggested an assassination plot. Lysandro's son Lysaro took over the bank, but then embezzled all the money within, ruining half the city. He ran away, and the rest of his siblings were put on trial. All their property was taken away, and their children were sold into slavery. Lysaro was found and whipped to death. In King's Landing, Unwin's men arrested Lara's brothers and the Hand of the King, Thaddeus Rowan. Aegon and his brother locked themselves in the Red Keep, refusing to hand over Lara. When Thaddeus proved innocent, a conspiracy to rid the city of the Lara and her family was uncovered. A new council of regents and small council was installed, and Torrhen Manderly of the North was installed as Hand of the King. Lara's brothers were mildly punished for their possible connection to the embezzlement. Torrhen Manderly ruled the realm well. He and the council planned a year-long journey for the king to undertake once he turned 16. On the morning of his 16th birthday, though, Aegon I walked into the council room and told Tyrion he was sitting in his seat. He dismissed them all from his service and said there would be no journey. Torrhen went home to the north, angry and embittered by his treatment.